Welcome down the warp pipe. I'm Ty, and on this episode of My Thoughts, I want to talk about Grime, a brand new Souls-like Metroidvania from Akupara Games. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know that they were gracious enough to provide me with a key to get some impressions and let you know my thoughts on it. So without further ado, let's get into what I thought about Grime, because I love my Souls-likes, but I'm not necessarily the biggest Metroidvania fan. Let's see what's in store. So getting all the info out there, Grime is available on Steam, which means it's for Windows and Mac. However, it's also available on Stadia if you prefer to play on a streaming service. Hopefully, this game actually gets a release on consoles later on. Here's holding out hope. The developers over at Cloverbyte and Spooky Doorway actually developed a really interesting game that specifically, it looked like it had a really fighting game influenced combat system in the game. Actually drew the most comparisons to Neo, at least in terms of what I was thinking of. Had kind of an ebb and flow to the combat. So once I jumped in here, I actually noticed that the game was really atmospheric. It has a lot of boisterous music in the beginning, but that quickly subsided into almost a foreboding quietness, which really just kind of draws you in, especially with the dark art aesthetic and the almost blinding nature of the lack of light in the opening area of the game. So the first thing I noticed was that the atmosphere was actually top-notch and went for a really specific, dark, almost horror aesthetic that personally, I love. I love that they have a horror aesthetic without it necessarily being a horror game. My best reference here is something like Gears of War when the first one came out. It was a horror aesthetic, but in the shoes of an action game. The other thing I really liked out of the initial play session that I did here, which was just up to the first boss and a little bit beyond, was that the level design seemed to push you in a specific direction. So although it's a Metroidvania and you're welcome to explore around, find secrets, it still was kind of pushing me in one direction. Great initial design there that I hope carries on throughout the rest of the game. The other thing that really stood out to me was the fact that the art direction was actually really creative. Although it takes a similar kind of headless horseman aesthetic that we've seen before in games like Dead Cells, the actual overall art aesthetic here, because it's rendered in 3D with an impressive amount of detail, especially in the darks, it really kind of gives an impression that the art team was going to town with their limb-obsessive design. Everything's kind of disjointed and creepy, but it's not disfigured in a disgusting way so much as it's disfigured in a interesting and almost provocative way. The initial moments of gameplay where it really emphasizes your kind of counter system actually got me excited, because I love a game with a good counter, and more specifically, I love a game that has what this game has, which is a attention to detail. So the combat system here is fairly basic in a traditional sense. You have your light attack, your heavy attack, and the thing that I mentioned before you learn, the counter. So the real interesting thing here is that the team seems to have gone with a really action game focus. It almost feels like the combat system was ripped out of Cyber Shadow or even a Ninja Gaiden game. It's really fast, really fluid, and specifically with the addition of the dash as well as your counter, it makes for a really great ebb and flow to the combat. It has the stamina resource management that you'd expect from something like a Dark Souls, or I would actually more equate it to Neo. So you need to kind of introduce yourself to the idea of pausing, deciding when it's better to jump, when it's better to dodge, and although I started off really strong and didn't have any problems, definitely by the time I got to that first boss fight, I had a few tricks that I should have been using up my sleeve, and I was not. However, the game is surprisingly forgiving, it seems, at least initially. So unlike a traditional Souls game, when you get back to your corpse, you don't have to defeat an enemy or pick something up. You actually just have to hit your body that's been disembodied from your head, so to speak. You just hit that and you get your, experience points back. However, The catch with this game, and actually that makes it really, really punishing, is that you only get half of what you originally had back. Meaning that every hit and every life lost really stings. And I didn't realize that until much later than I should have. So all of the moving mechanics here actually really feel very fluid. Things like countering an enemy attack is really good because as soon as you hit the counter button, it overrides any attack you were doing, and more specifically, you can even dash out of those situations if you happen to mess up, as long as you have the stamina available to do something about it. That is a sign of a great combat system as far as I'm concerned. The combat system had me hooked out of the gate, especially once you get your weapon. It takes a little while to get going, but that atmosphere that I mentioned and getting a hang of the counter system is really enforced, which I think is a great initial design philosophy. So let's talk about something that I'm not gonna knock specifically Grime for having, because every single 3D rendered side-scrolling platformer I've played has it, and that's the floaty jump. I don't know what it is about using the physics from a 3D engine, but they just don't quite feel right when compared to the programmatical gravity that's built into something that's using pixels versus a 3D render for its jump mechanics. As I mentioned, this isn't a knock against Grime because every game has it, and to its credit, the jump actually fits the gameplay really well. It gives you a few moments in the air to decide whether you want to do a slamming attack down, or you want to maybe move a little bit left, move a little bit right, or even just do an air attack. The thing is, when you're falling off of a platform, it feels like you should start following a little bit quicker than you do. As I mentioned, this isn't a problem with the game, and it actually handles it quite good. So although it has a floaty jump, it feels appropriate, and more specifically, it fits the combat of the game. It's the least offensive floaty jump that I've experienced in any game. I'll do a video on floaty jump another time because I don't want to take away from the rest of the game. So as you'd expect from a Souls or Metroidvania or even just an action RPG, there's a loot system and more specifically items that you can equip. So whether it's different weapons and you can play around with the different weapon styles, there is some leveling that's required in order to equip some of the later items. So I didn't get a chance to play around with everything that was at my disposal because I threw all of my points into dealing extra damage versus strength, which would have allowed me to equip different weapons and armor, but I was still happy with the two options available to me. And more specifically, the initial starting weapon just felt really natural. Has a nice overhead swing and actually seems like it could be kind of like the weapon that Bloodborne's known for. That's actually another thing I'd like to bring up, a close comparison to Bloodborne. So in the game, when you're completing counters, you build up a meter. Once this meter is full, you can use the right trigger, if you're playing on an Xbox controller like I was, to give yourself a revive of your health. This is a really interesting mechanic because when you counter an enemy, it deals damage to them the same way that you could use an attack to. So you almost have to start deciding whether you want to counter an enemy, build up the meter so you can regen health later on, or if you just want to attack them and get them out of your way. It's an interesting thought, and I'm sure it comes into play a lot more later on in the game than it does in the initial hour, but it was still something that was nice to see because the Bloodborne mechanic of stealing health and reviving, I haven't seen too many people copy that a whole lot, and this is the best way I've seen something implemented that was paying homage without directly copying that system. The other thing that was kind of unique to the game is that as you level up, you don't just get your traditional level ups, but you can actually unlock what's called hunt points by defeating specifically powerful enemies and putting those into unique abilities that you earn, like their passive abilities or even giving you different options. It was actually a kind of cool mechanic to have to earn those from finding and defeating difficult enemies rather than just getting them through a traditional level up system. And ultimately, because it's a complementary system, I'm sure there's going to be a few ones I gotta hunt down later and really sink my teeth into. Ultimately, the game has a lot of environmental storytelling, and although it does still have traditional characters speaking dialogue that you can read off the screen, I actually kind of just skipped through most of it because I wanted to get into the meat and potatoes and start playing around. Especially once I got the weapons and started getting into the combat system, it really started to open up and become something that I wanted to push forward, find the next secret, and more specifically, get to that boss fight. And that's the thing about the first boss fight that I played in this. I actually thought I'd be totally competent going into it, having trounced all the other enemies beforehand without nary a worry, but the game actually threw me for a loop with the first boss fight. Not because it was difficult in terms of being able to grasp or poorly balanced. It wasn't that there was a difficulty spike. It's more so that I just got overconfident. So as soon as I got into the boss fight, I just started attacking, dodging, almost treating it more like Cyber Shadow than something like Neo or Dark Souls. Completely forgetting about the stamina system because the combat felt so flowy and almost counterintuitive to have a stamina system with it. I think the game actually benefits from having it because it would be far too easy if you could just dash around and attack without any regard for how much resource you have to use to expend that attack or that dash. For the short period of time I had today to check it out, with going through and beating that boss finally, and then moving on to the second area, where I noticed one thing in particular. Not only did the game start brightening up, which was really cool and gave a stark contrast to that opening dark area, while still looking ominous and foreboding, but it also pointed to where I needed to go on the map. This is something I haven't seen any Metroidvania do before. Now, I'm not saying that no other Metroidvania does it, but as someone who isn't the hugest fan of Metroidvanias, but loves Souls-likes, I was actually really happy that Grime decided to show me where I would ultimately need to go. So even if it didn't tell me the exact path, I knew the direction I needed to head in. And that's the most important thing. I don't mind wandering around, especially in a game that has an interesting environment and fun combat mechanics. But I want to know where I need to go. The most annoying thing to me is having to wander around to find out where I'm going, rather than just pointing me in the direction and I can decide if I want to make a detour. But I want to thank again Akupara Games for sending me the key and allowing me to take a quick look and share with you my initial impressions of Grime. I was excited about the combat system, and specifically because it had the dash, attacks, counters that I love in a game like Neo, but in a side-scroller. I was really excited. And I'm excited to jump into more of it when I can get some time. Unfortunately, it's been a crazy, hectic weekend for me, and I originally planned on playing the game a lot more than I had time to. But it's good to know that I wasn't wrong with my initial thoughts while watching the trailers, and that I do want to jump back in and finish Grime. So if you haven't checked it out, right now it's on sale for 10% off on Steam, so you can click down the link below to jump over to Steam and check it out. Or, as always, you can check it out on Google Stadia. Unfortunately, I don't have the link there because I am not a Google Stadia subscriber, so I'm not sure how their system works. But as I mentioned in the opening, I really hope this game gets ported to PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, and everything else, because it's a lot of fun. And I have a couple friends that I know exclusively play on consoles that would definitely enjoy this game. But as always, let me know what you think down below. Have you checked out Grime? Do you plan on checking it out? And as always, I'll catch you next Games Tuesday. Thanks for checking out my initial impressions of Grime. If you aren't subscribed to the channel, consider hitting it down below. I've recently started doing shorts every Saturday to share some kind of fun bloopers. See you guys, as always, on Games Tuesday.